England in the year 878 bore no resemblance to the mighty kingdom many picture in their minds. Stone fortresses didn't exist. Knights clad in full armor were nowhere to be found. Grand cathedrals with colored glass towering over bustling cities were still centuries away from being built. The England of 878 was a place of timber structures, dirt pathways, smoky hearthstones, isolated farmsteads, and unrelenting dread. Nearly all its kingdoms had already collapsed before the Viking onslaught. The northern territories were lost, the eastern lands were gone, the central regions had disintegrated. Only Wessex in the southern part remained standing, and just barely. While King Alfred struggled to keep his realm from falling apart, common folk still needed to make their bread, look after their livestock, offer their prayers, fix their rooftops, and lie down each evening uncertain of what dawn might bring from beyond the horizon. This was the true reality of England during Alfred's reign, not the mythical version, but the actual existence that regular people endured. We're going to examine Alfred's England piece by piece. First, we'll observe the terrain itself, the settlements, the pathways, the waterways, and the dispersed communities where most inhabitants never ventured beyond their birthplace. Then we'll enter their dwellings, gather near their flames, and witness what everyday existence actually resembled for a typical Anglo-Saxon household. Then we'll examine the elements that made this existence tangible, the meals they consumed, the garments they wrapped themselves in, the labor that occupied their hands from sunrise to sunset. And finally, we'll sense the darkness that loomed over everything, the terror, the belief, and the Viking menace that influenced every choice, every supplication, and every restless night. To grasp what existence meant in 878, you must first comprehend what sort of place England actually was. It wasn't a unified nation, it was a mosaic, a cluster of separate kingdoms, each ruled by its own monarch, each with distinct traditions, each with its own understanding of who they were. And by 878, most of those kingdoms had been annihilated. The great heathen army, the enormous Viking invasion force that had arrived in East Anglia in 865, had ravaged Britain in barely more than 10 years. Northumbria had been destroyed, East Anglia had been subjugated. Mercia, the powerful kingdom of Middle England, had been diminished to almost nothing, its eastern territories under Viking occupation, its western remnant struggling to survive under Alfred's shield. The Danelaw, the enormous region of England under Viking domination, now stretched across the north and the east. Danish colonists were cultivating soil that had belonged to Anglo-Saxons for generations. Danish rulers occupied halls where English nobles had once presided. Danish settlement names were erasing English ones. The frontier wasn't always a visible line across the terrain, but everyone understood which side they inhabited. And everyone remembered what had befallen those who had attempted to fight back. Only Wessex stayed unconquered. Wessex extended across southern England, from the wetlands of Somerset in the west to the boundaries of Kent in the east. Its core region was chalk hills, river basins, and oak woodlands. Its capital, if you could call it that, was Winchester, a settlement of perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 inhabitants enclosed by ancient Roman fortifications that had been restored and reinforced by Alfred's builders. But Winchester was hardly an impressive metropolis. It was a functional settlement. Wooden dwellings crammed tightly within Roman stone barriers, muddy thoroughfares, marketplace stalls, a humble cathedral, a royal enclosure where Alfred conducted his affairs, judged disputes, and organized the protection of a kingdom encircled on 3 flanks by hostile forces. Beyond Winchester, Wessex was overwhelmingly countryside. Tiny villages, remote farms, scattered hamlets linked by tracks that became mud when it rained and dust during summer. The Roman highways were still present, decaying, overtaken by vegetation in sections, but still the finest routes across the land. Everything else was a trail created by feet and hooves through fields and forests. This was the England that Alfred was attempting to preserve. Not a nation in any contemporary meaning, not a realm with boundaries and administration, but a fragile assembly of communities bound together by allegiance, by the church, by common tongue, and by the stark reality that the other option was surrender to the Danes. And for the common people inhabiting that realm, the cultivators, the artisans, the women crushing grain and repairing fabric, the youngsters watching over pigs in the woodland, the grand political conflicts of monarchs and military leaders were remote, theoretical, nearly meaningless. What concerned them was the crop yield, the climate, the condition of their beasts, the roof that needed repairing before the storms arrived, the bread that needed baking, the fire that needed maintaining, and the question that never fully disappeared: would the Vikings arrive this season? If you were suddenly placed in the England of 878, the first thing that would strike you is how vacant it felt. The population of all England in the late 9th century was likely somewhere between 1 and 2 million inhabitants. The landscape that today accommodates 67 million held in Alfred's era a vast patchwork of woodland, wetland, scrubland, and cleared farmland, interrupted only occasionally by traces of human settlement. Villages were tiny. A standard Anglo-Saxon community might contain 10 or 15 households, perhaps 50 to 80 inhabitants altogether. The dwellings grouped together in a loose arrangement, encircled by fields that extended outward in long, open sections. There were no hedgerows separating them, no stone barriers. The fields were communal, cultivated by the village collectively under a structure of shared duty and tradition. The dwellings themselves were constructed from timber, wattle, and daub, a framework of oak posts with walls formed from interwoven hazel or willow branches covered over with a dense mixture of clay, straw, and animal waste. The roofs were thatched, thick bundles of straw or reeds compressed tightly and angled steeply to drain the rain. From the exterior, an Anglo-Saxon dwelling appeared low, dark, and crude. From the interior, it felt even more confined. A single chamber, perhaps 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, dominated by a central hearth. The fire pit rested on the packed earth floor, surrounded with stones. Smoke climbed from the burning wood and drifted upward through the thatch because there was no chimney. The rafters were blackened with soot. The air was dense and warm and irritated the eyes. Light entered from the fire and from the doorway. Windows, if they existed at all, were small openings covered with shutters. When the door was shut and the shutters drawn, the interior remained dim even at midday. Along the walls, low wooden benches functioned as seats, work surfaces, and sleeping platforms. A few storage boxes contained clothing, implements, and whatever modest possessions the household owned. Pots, pans, and cooking tools hung from hooks or rested on the floor near the hearth. The floor itself was packed earth, sometimes layered with rushes or straw that grew filthy and damp and required replacement. Outside the dwelling, the village had a rhythm and a form that had remained unchanged for generations. A small church stood somewhere near the middle, or what served as a middle. Not an impressive structure, a basic construction of timber, perhaps with a stone base if the village was well off, with a thatched roof and a wooden cross above the entrance. The church was the center of the community. Births, marriages, deaths, holy days, quarrels, and confessions, all of them moved through this structure. Beyond the church, a few shared structures served the village. A well or a spring, a communal oven where bread was made, perhaps a small forge where a local blacksmith mended implements and sharpened edges. Animal enclosures stood at the boundaries of the settlement, keeping livestock near enough to protect but distant enough to control the stench. Though in reality, the stench was omnipresent. The tracks between villages weren't roads. They were paths carved into the earth by years of passage, broadened by cart wheels, and narrowed again by rainfall. In summer, they were navigable. In autumn and winter, they transformed into streams of mud. Travel was slow, arduous, and frequently perilous. Not because of thieves, though those existed, but because of the sheer physical challenge of moving through a landscape without paved surfaces, bridges, or markers. Rivers were the finest highways. The Thames, the Severn, the Avon, the Stour. These were the routes that linked communities, transported goods, and enabled commerce. Small vessels moved up and down the waterways, transporting grain, wool, timber, salt, and iron. A journey that might require days on foot could be completed in hours by water. The towns were scarce and small. Winchester, Exeter, Bath, Wareham. These were the largest settlements in Wessex, and none of them contained more than a few thousand inhabitants. Most were constructed within ancient Roman fortifications. The Anglo-Saxons had not erected walls of their own until Alfred initiated his program of fortified towns, the burhs, which in 878 was still in its beginning stages. A town like Winchester had a marketplace, a mint, workshops for artisans, and a church or two. Its streets were arranged more formally than a village, but they were still muddy, narrow, and filled with animals, carts, and inhabitants. The dwellings were timber, pressed close together, with workshops opening straight onto the street. Beyond the towns and villages, the landscape was untamed. Thick forests of oak, ash, and elm blanketed much of England. Marshes and wetlands sprawled across the lowlands, the Somerset levels, the fens of East Anglia, the river floodplains that became shallow lakes every winter. Heathland and rough pasture occupied the spaces between settlements. This was not a domesticated landscape. It was a landscape that people inhabited cautiously, always conscious of how much of it lay beyond their mastery. Those who have followed along this far clearly value history presented with care. That matters deeply. Now, let us enter the dwelling itself. The day started while darkness still held. In a village dwelling across Wessex, typically a woman stirred first. She lifted herself from the bench that served as her bed, still wrapped in her woolen covering, and crouched beside the hearth to breathe life back into the buried coals. A pinch of dried grass first, then thin twigs, followed by heavier wood pieces, arranged with precision until flames took hold and smoke drifted upward into the straw roof overhead. The hearth was central to everything. It provided warmth, illumination, and the sole means of preparing food. Allowing the embers to die completely during the night was not merely a mistake, but a genuine crisis, since creating fire anew using flint, steel, and dry kindling could consume considerable time. During the depths of winter, every moment without warmth threatened survival. With flames established, the next priority was water. The closest supply might be a well, natural spring, or stream bank. Water came back in wooden containers, cumbersome and heavy, balanced on shoulders or clutched with both hands. In winter months, the earth was frozen solid, pathways became hazardous, and the water itself bit with cold. The morning meal was straightforward. A porridge from oats or barley simmered in water, or thin ale, occasionally enriched with a pinch of dried herbs or a fragment of aged cheese mixed through. Any bread remaining from the previous day, if available, was torn into chunks and consumed alongside the porridge. Sugar did not exist, nor tea, nor coffee. The beverage was ale, weak, cloudy, faintly sour, made at home and drunk by all, children included, since water often carried risk. Following the morning meal, labor commenced, and it continued without pause until darkness returned. For men, labor meant the fields. Plowing in spring using a heavy wooden plow drawn by oxen, scattering seed by hand, flinging it across the furrows, weeding throughout summer, harvesting in late summer and early autumn, slicing the grain with sickles, bundling it into sheaves, hauling it to the threshing ground. In winter, when fields lay dormant, rest still did not come. Fences required repair, tools needed attention, firewood demanded cutting. Animals required feeding, watering, and supervision. The animals were fundamental to survival. Cattle yielded milk, leather, and ultimately meat, though a farmer would not kill a healthy cow except under dire circumstances. Living cattle held far greater value. Sheep produced wool, critical for both clothing and commerce. Pigs foraged through woodland, consuming acorns and roots, and served as the primary meat source. Chickens and geese supplied eggs. Bees delivered honey, the sole available sweetener. For women, the labor was equally unending and equally essential. Grinding grain was a daily necessity. The quern, two flat stones with one rotating atop the other, occupied nearly every household. Grain was fed in at the top and ground by hand into rough flour. The work was draining, repetitive, and the grit from the stones mixed into the flour and gradually wore down the teeth of everyone consuming the bread produced from it. Bread was baked nearly every day. Dough was formed by hand and baked in a clay oven or on a flat stone beside the fire. The bread was dark, compact, and heavy, fashioned from barley, rye, or oats, seldom from wheat, which cost more and grew less widely. It formed the basis of every meal. Apart from bread, the food of common people was plain and unchanging. Pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables could be found, was the mainstay. Onions, leeks, cabbages, beans, peas, turnips, and parsnips filled the pot. In a prosperous season, some meat might join them, a portion of salted pork, a smoked fish, a rabbit taken from the woodland. In a lean season, the pottage ran thin and servings grew small. Cheese was produced from sheep's milk or cow's milk and consumed year-round. Fish, freshwater varieties from rivers and ponds, salted or smoked shellfish from coastal areas, played an important dietary role, particularly during the numerous fast days mandated by the church. The garments of common people were functional and coarse. Wool dominated. Women spun raw wool into thread using a drop spindle, a weighted stick that twisted fibers as it rotated, then wove the thread into fabric on upright looms standing against the dwelling wall. The rhythmic clicking of loom weights formed one of the constant sounds of household life. Men wore a long woolen or linen tunic cinched at the waist, paired with loose trousers bound at the calf with cloth or leather strips. Over the tunic went a heavier woolen cloak fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or pin. On their feet, leather shoes or boots, hand-stitched and rarely weatherproof. On their heads, a hood or plain cap. Women wore a long linen undergown beneath an outer woolen gown, cinched or clasped at the waist. A head covering, a length of fabric wound around the hair, was standard. Brooches, pins, and simple belt fixtures were the only adornment most women possessed. The colors were subdued. Natural wool ranged from cream through brown to dark gray. Dyes existed, wode for blue, weld for yellow, madder for red, but brightly dyed fabric carried high cost and typically remained reserved for the wealthy. Most people wore the hues of the sheep that had grown the wool. Leather appeared everywhere. Belts, pouches, knife sheaths, shoes, harnesses, buckets, and straps. A small practical knife hung from nearly every belt. Not a weapon, but an indispensable tool for the countless small cutting tasks filling a working day. The dwellings carried the scent of smoke, of damp wool, of animal fat, of the earthy sweetness from drying herbs, and of the less pleasant odors from bodies, animals, and the waste pit behind the dwelling. Privacy had no existence. Families slept, ate, worked, quarreled, and prayed in a single room within arm's reach of one another, within hearing distance of neighbors, within view of the animal pen just beyond the door. This was not poverty as modern people conceive it. It was simply existence. The only existence that anyone in a Saxon village had ever encountered or could picture. If you questioned an ordinary person in Alfred's England about what mattered most in their existence, the answer would not have been the king. It would not have been politics or warfare or the fate of kingdoms. It would have been God and fear. The two were inseparable. Christianity had stood as the faith of the Anglo-Saxons for more than 2 centuries by 878. The old pagan gods, Woden, Thunor, Tiw, endured in place names and in the days of the week, but they were echoes, not living beliefs. The church stood at the center of every community. The priest ranked as the most significant figure in the village after the Lord. The rhythm of the church calendar, Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, the feast days of saints, gave structure to the entire year. People attended church not because it brought pleasure, but because it was vital. The priest baptized their children, blessed their crops, heard their confessions, joined them in marriage, laid them to rest, and instructed them on what God required. And what God required, according to 9th century church teaching, was obedience, humility, prayer, and the shunning of sin. The consequences for failure were not abstract. Hell held reality. The devil held reality. The judgment awaiting after death was as certain as the harvest. The village church was plain: timber walls, a thatched roof, a rough wooden altar, a cross. In larger settlements or monasteries, there might stand a stone church, but these remained uncommon outside the towns. Inside, the space was bare. No seating, people stood or knelt on the earthen floor. A few candles on the altar, perhaps a crude painting on the wall depicting a saint or a scene from scripture. The services were conducted in Latin, which virtually no one in the congregation comprehended, but the rituals were familiar, reassuring, and woven so thoroughly into daily existence that their significance was experienced rather than examined. Monks and clergy in the larger centers, Winchester, Glastonbury, Sherborne, sustained the intellectual life of the church. They copied manuscripts by candlelight in cold writing rooms. They maintained collections of books gathered across generations. They taught reading and writing to the sons of nobles and to boys destined for priesthood. Alfred himself invested deeply in this effort. He believed that learning had deteriorated across England, and his assessment was accurate. By 878, literacy beyond the monasteries had virtually vanished. But for most people, faith was not intellectual, it was practical. You prayed for rain, you prayed for health, you prayed for your animals, your children, your crops. You prayed that winter would not claim you, that the harvest would not collapse, and that the Vikings would not arrive. The Vikings. The fear was not constant in the manner of a war zone. It resembled more closely living beside a volcano. The eruption might not occur this year, it might not occur next year, but it had occurred before, and everyone understood it could occur again at any moment. In villages near the Danelaw border, in northern Wessex, in the western reaches of Mercia, the fear was immediate. Raiding parties could materialize with scant warning. A handful of longships on the river, a column of armed men on the road, the smoke from a burning farm on the horizon. The response was flight. Most villages possessed no defenses. There were no walls, no towers, no garrison. The people simply fled into the woods, into the marshes, toward the nearest fortified location if one existed. They carried what they could manage: children, a sack of grain, a tool, a blanket. Everything else remained behind. Alfred was constructing a system to alter this. The burhs, fortified towns encircled by earthen ramparts and timber walls, were being planned and in certain places already rising from the ground. The concept was straightforward. Every person in Wessex should be able to reach a fortified refuge within one day's walk, a place to find safety when raiders came. Yet by 878, the network remained incomplete. Countless villages still lacked protection. Even in regions distant from the borderlands, anxiety influenced daily life. News arrived with those passing through. An eastbound trader might share whispers of Danish unrest. A monk returning from sacred travels might describe what he witnessed in conquered lands. Sanctuaries reduced to ash, abbeys stripped bare, people driven from their homes. After darkness fell in the villages, men discussed protection. What arms did they possess? Perhaps a spear inherited from an ancestor, a circular timber shield reinforced with iron at its center, a sea-axe, the wide blade with one sharpened edge that had given the Anglo-Saxons their identity. These were not military arms. These were tools kept by farmers beside their doorways, honed when troubling news arrived, prayed never to be used. Sentries stood watch at settlement boundaries when danger seemed near. A figure positioned on high ground at first light, searching the distance for approaching threats. A young boy ordered to scale a riverside tree to spot incoming vessels. A woman tending a deliberately small fire through the night to prevent telltale smoke from revealing where people sheltered. The church bell, ringing at an unexpected hour, brought the deepest dread to village hearts. A single tone signaled worship. 3 rapid peals meant threat. When that threat materialized, there existed no plan, no established procedure, no coordinated defense. There remained only the dreadful, all too familiar scramble of seizing whatever you could carry and fleeing. Families became divided in the pandemonium. Mothers lost children among the trees. Fathers remained behind to delay pursuers. Some concealed themselves in trenches beneath piled hay, inside the cavities of old-growth timber. Others were discovered. Some vanished forever. This defined what Viking danger meant to common folk. Not some distant battlefield engagement, not tales recited by entertainers in royal chambers. A noise piercing the darkness, rising smoke against the sky, a split-second choice determining whether your household lived or died. Did Alfred grasp this reality? His entire defensive strategy, the fortified towns, the reorganized militia, the system of warning fires and mounted messengers, rested on recognizing that Wessex's people could not endure perpetual terror. They required protective barriers. They required advance notice. They required faith that authority figures were actively working to shield them. But in 878, that effort remained in its infancy. For most inhabitants of Alfred's realm, fear dominated everything. To exist in Alfred's England meant inhabiting an incomplete world. The kingdom had not yet become a unified nation. Boundaries remained uncertain. Laws awaited codification, though Alfred had already begun composing them. Educational institutions did not yet exist, though Alfred was already designing them. The language itself continued evolving, still incorporating foreign vocabulary and pronunciation, still transforming into the English that would eventually spread devolving. Alfred's achievement was not one decisive moment of glory. It was a prolonged, laborious, unremarkable process of construction. While Wessex's people prepared food and repaired property and worshipped and worried and persisted, their ruler pursued something remarkably few 9th century leaders attempted. He was creating order. The fortified settlements were not merely defensive positions. They were deliberately designed communities, arranged with pathways and commercial areas, intended to draw inhabitants, promote commerce, and establish the economic foundation necessary for sustained protection. Each fortified town maintained a garrison recruited from nearby lands. Every household in Wessex owed a designated number of men to their local stronghold. The arrangement was imperfect and remained unfinished when Alfred died, yet it marked the beginning of something previously absent: coordinated national defense. Deferred, the militia of freemen underwent reform. Rather than summoning every capable man simultaneously, which abandoned farms and left villages exposed, Alfred split the duty. Half served while the remainder stayed home. This enabled Wessex to field fighting forces for extended periods without causing widespread starvation. Alfred also committed resources to scholarship. He summoned learned men from Mercia, from Wales, from continental lands. He personally rendered Latin works into Old English, a remarkable undertaking for any monarch, revealing much about his character. He believed that England's educational decline represented not just cultural impoverishment, but strategic vulnerability. A kingdom unable to comprehend its own statutes, unable to document its own past, unable to train its own clergy, was a kingdom destined to fail. He established schools. He built a court valuing literacy. He created a written legal code drawing from earlier Anglo-Saxon traditions and scripture, distributing it throughout Wessex so justice would be uniform and transparent. None of this proved dramatic. None generated compelling narratives. No poet would compose songs celebrating a king who restructured military service schedules or translated scholarly texts into common speech. Yet this work, quiet, steady, unspectacular, transformed Wessex from a realm struggling to survive into one capable of lasting. This foundation enabled Alfred's descendants to expand Wessex into Mercia, into East Anglia, into Northumbria, until, by the mid-10th century, something reasonably called England existed for the first time. The people preparing food in 878 did not recognize this. The woman working her spinning wheel beside the hearth did not realize she lived during a nation's birth. The farmer repairing his boundary in the rain did not understand that the king taxing his harvest was simultaneously constructing the concept of a country. They knew only their immediate tasks: the bread, the fire, the children, the prayers, and the hope, faint, persistent, rarely voiced, that this coming winter might be the final one they faced isolated and unprotected. Under Alfred, England was still taking form. For most people, history did not manifest as grand pronouncements or celebrated victories. It manifested as scarcity, as worship, as toil, as gossip, and as endurance. The monumental events recorded in written accounts, the clashes, the agreements, the coronations, were distant reverberations in a world where the most critical question was whether provisions would last until warmer seasons returned. Yet from that harsh and uncertain existence, something permanent began emerging. Not because one ruler demanded it, but because thousands of nameless people, individuals never documented, never portrayed, never commemorated, did what humans have always done. They rose each morning, they kindled the fire, they nourished the children, they labored until daylight failed, and they refused, quietly and without theatrics, to allow their world to vanish. This was not yet the England of stone fortresses and grand cathedrals, of governing assemblies and global dominion. It was smaller, coarser, more vulnerable, and more authentically human. To live in Alfred's England was to inhabit a world still forming itself, half desperate survival, half hopeful beginning.